Well, hello everyone. I'm Christy Welter, and I'm your host today on this episode of Minority Report, and we have a very special guest with us. This is Jesse J. Holland, and Jesse, why don't you tell us kind of what you do? I know you wear a lot of hats, so.
Well, thank you. I'm very glad to be here with you today. Well, my name is Jesse J. Holland. I am currently serving this semester as the Visiting Distinguished Professor of Ethics and Journalism at the University of Arkansas. I'm also the Race and Ethnicity Reporter for the Associated Press in Washington, D.C. And I'm also wearing a third hat as an author, where I had a book come out earlier this year called The Invisibles, The Untold Story of African American Slaves in the White House. And my first fiction work came out last month in September, which was called Star Wars, The Force Awakens, Finn's Story. So I'm juggling a lot of things right now, so I'm really glad to be here with you today, to be able to sit down and be here with you today.
So I don't know how you do all of this. I mean, you wrote your book while you're reporting and did all that research as well. Mm-hmm. So can you tell us a little bit about what that process looks like for you? Well,
at heart, no matter what I'm doing, I feel like I'm a writer. If I'm writing, I'm happy. So everything that I do in my life, no matter whether it's in journalism, in nonfiction, or it's fiction, it revolves around writing. So as long as I can keep pen to paper, finger to keyboard, I'm happy. But I will admit that it does take a little juggling to make sure everything is done and everything gets completed when it should be. But luckily, I actually started out as a journalist. I got my degree in journalism from the University of Mississippi. So I've actually been a working journalist now since 1994.
So you had to do all this research with the Star Wars book, and similarly, you had about 7 years of work, you said, on the book, The Invisibles, which Michelle Obama referred to in her Democratic National Convention speech. Right. So kind of a big deal.
It was actually a very big deal for me because I was actually at the Democratic National Convention covering Michelle Obama's speech from the floor of the Wells Fargo Center. And I had no idea she was going to say this. So I'm basically wandering around the floor, half listening to Michelle Obama and interviewing delegates when I hear her say, "I live in a house that was built by slaves." I'm like, did she say it? She said it. And of course, this being the social media age, I immediately stopped, take out my iPhone, and take a selfie with Michelle Obama in the background.
Well, it kind of went viral with your friends, right?
It certainly, my phone started exploding. All of my friends who were watching it and knew that I wrote this book started calling me. And I actually started getting calls from newspapers as well, because at that time, and I believe still to today, my book is the only book that's been written solely about the slaves who lived inside the White House.
So you're obviously passionate about reporting on race and diversity issues. Right. And so with this book, being able to clear some of those facts up, what was that like for you?
Well, I mean, it was surprising to me how few people knew that slaves actually lived inside the White House. I knew it personally because when I wrote my first book, which was called Black Men Built the Capitol, which was published back in 2007, I actually dedicated a chapter in that book to the slaves who actually built the Capitol, the U.S. Capitol and the White House. So I knew this because I had done this research back in 2005. But it continually surprised me at the number of people who didn't know slavery was used at all to
I had no idea.
to build the U.S.
Yeah.
Capitol, and not only the Capitol but the White House. So when I got ready to work on a second book, I actually remember the time when I actually made the decision to write this book. I was actually covering the first presidential campaign of then Senator Barack Obama. We were actually in Chicago for a weekend for when Barack Obama had decided to get off the campaign trail and go home and just relax for a weekend. And of course, if you're in the presidential press corps, you're not invited inside the house. So the entire press corps is sitting on a bus a couple of blocks down the street from Barack Obama's townhouse. And I remember sitting on that bus and thinking, okay, it's time to get working on your next book. What do you want to write about? And I remember thinking that how historic it would be if Barack Obama won the election and became the first black man to live inside the White House. And I remember immediately fact-checking myself, correcting myself and saying, wait a minute, that's not right. Barack Obama can't have been the first black man to live inside the White House because there were slaves held by the early presidents, and they had to live inside the White House as well. Who were these slaves? What were their lives like? What happened to them when their president left the White House? And it was at that moment where I decided that The Invisibles would be the next book that I would write. And it ended up being just about a 7-year project. I conceived the book in 2007, and it was published in January 2016. So,
wow, so basically through Barack Obama's entire presidency,
you
were working on this book.
Exactly. And I will tell you that when I started the project, I wasn't sure how willing the presidential libraries and presidential plantations of the original presidents would be to talk about slavery. Because even today, the existence of slavery in the United States is a controversial topic. And there are people who feel in different ways about it. So I wasn't sure that the presidential plantations, who make a lot of their money off tourism, were going to be willing to talk with me about the slaves that their presidents took to the White House. And I was pleasantly surprised that at every turn, every single person that I asked for helped me. Whether it was Mount Vernon, whether it was Monticello, whether it was the Hermitage in Tennessee, all of these plantations said to me in unison that this is research that we would like to have.
And they want these stories to be told.
And they want these stories to be told.
What is the craziest thing you have ever seen while covering politics?
If you say crazy in journalism, this jumps immediately to my mind. Back when I was working in the Columbia, South Carolina Bureau of the AP, a Ku Klux Klan fan decided that he was going to open the country's very first KKK paraphernalia shop outside
What year was this?
Outside of Greenville, South Carolina. This was around 1997, 1998. It was actually, and he titled his shop The Redneck Shop. And I, for some reason, got assigned to go cover the opening of the Redneck Shop in Greenville, outside of Greenville, South Carolina. I remember driving up to the Redneck Shop, and I met a photographer up there, because at this point I was assigned in Columbia, South Carolina, and Columbia is about 2.5 hours away from Greenville. So I remember driving up to the Greenville area, and I don't think the shop was actually in Greenville. It was in a little town outside of Greenville. And I remember driving up to the shop and meeting the photographer up there and interviewing, I will say, this very friendly guy who tried to explain to me why the world needed a KKK paraphernalia shop. And I remember going in the shop, looking at some of the material that he was selling to the public. But the crazy part was, this guy goes into the back, brings out a KKK robe, and asks me if I want to try it on. I remember just being flabbergasted that he would even ask.
No kidding.
But I am at work, so I'm going to be professional. So I politely said, not this time. and ended up driving back to Columbia and writing the story about the redneck shop in South Carolina. Luckily, I shouldn't say luckily, the redneck shop did not last long. The community in which the guy opened the store decided that it was not the type of reputation they wanted their town to have. And the redneck shop closed down, I think pretty soon after that. So that would be even in this was at the beginning of my career. Still, that is the craziest thing that I've had happen to me, to have someone ask me if I wanted to, in public, try on a KKK robe.
Well,
No,
it's insulting, and
Yeah.
I'm curious how you were able to walk into that and still to cover that story without, I guess, I don't know if bias is the right word, but
Oh no, bias is the right word.
Going in there and
completely.
not-
Bias is the right word. One of the things that you learn in journalism school is that you're not going to agree with every assignment that you're going to get. But it is incumbent upon you as a professional journalist to be able to put aside your bias and write as objectively about every story as you can. That actually wasn't my first Klan story I wrote in South Carolina. Really? One of the first stories I was assigned when I came to the Columbia, South Carolina Bureau was an actual one-on-one interview with the Grand Wizard in South Carolina, who at that point lived in West Columbia, South Carolina. And I was invited by the Grand Wizard to come out to his trailer home and do a one-on-one interview with him. I made sure I didn't go out there by myself.
Sure.
I rode in the car with a photographer. And sat down with the Grand Wizard and actually conducted what I thought was a pretty fair interview with him, and went back to the office and wrote the story. The Grand Wizard calls me the next day after the story's published and tells me that while he doesn't agree with everything I put in the story, he had to admit that I was fair. And as a journalist, that's all we look for. I mean, there's no way I can say going into that story, I did not have an opinion about the Klan.
Absolutely.
I have a definite opinion about the Klan. But hopefully, if you're a professional journalist, you can put your opinion about any one subject to the side and report that story as objectively and as fairly as you can. Especially when I write political stories, if I get supporters of Hillary Clinton and supporters of Donald Trump both calling me saying the story's unfair, then I know I did the right thing in the story.
And you've mentioned to me before that race and diversity issues, that is something that is continuing to grow in coverage. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the coverage of police brutality and what could be better, what could be worse, what worked?
One of the things that we've seen over the last 5 years is an increasing coverage of what seems to be the killing of African American men and women by police, and sometimes even the killing of unarmed African American men and women by police. And for those of us in the media, especially those of us who are minorities in the media, these stories didn't just start 5 years ago. There have been anecdotal stories about these deaths for years. But what has changed over the last 5 years is the advent of the personal cell phone camera, to where there's actual video proof of some of these things happening. In the past, the media would automatically assume whatever story the police said about the death of someone they had to shoot, the death of someone who died in police custody, we would automatically take the police's version of the story to be the truth. But what we've seen through the advent of the personal cell phone camera is that the first story that the police tell isn't always exactly what happened. Sometimes the stories that the people tell who are witnesses to what happened is what is the truth, and not the story that the police tell. So we're seeing more and more through the advent of personal cell phone cameras that there is another story than the story that the police are telling. So what we've seen over the last few years is more and more diversity of story that's being told about the police shootings, where we now know we can't always take the police's version of events as what exactly happened. But now that there's actual video of these incidents, it has evolved beyond a conversation that's just being held in the African American community to a conversation that's being held around the country, and I think rightfully so.
Yes, I mean, I know I've learned so much about this over the last few years, and it's something that I had no knowledge of beforehand. And so I think it's very important that the public is kind of understanding this. On that note, though, I'm curious what you're thinking about the release of these videos, because they're pretty graphic.
Well, a lot of these videos are first going out on the internet, which has no filters. They will show exactly what the person sent out.
So they'll be out there anyways.
So it's going to be out there anyway. But I will say that one of the things that we're looking at now is whether the American public has become hardened to these videos. The first few that came out, everyone was shocked, everyone was talking about it. But when you get to the 10th video, when you get to the 15th video, when you get to the 20th video, are these videos losing their impact? Because there's so many of them. Are they losing their impact on the American public? Is there a police beating video fatigue?
So you think that possibly the public is becoming desensitized to this, to police brutality videos, whereas we really need to continue to fight this fight. And is that
first of all, it's sad that there's been so many of these videos that there's a possibility of people becoming hardened to them. It's sad that there's been so many of these videos that there's even the possibility of fatigue. But the reality is that we see one of these videos come out almost every few weeks. And each time a video comes out, there seems to be a day or two of conversation, and then the American public moves on to the next thing. So while the videos are serving a purpose, there has been some questioning of the number of videos and how effective they're going to be in the future as we keep seeing them come out over and over and over again. But luckily, there have definitely been conversations within police departments, within cities, within towns, within state legislators, within Congress, and even in the presidential election, of trying to find ways to mend the relationship between police, law enforcement, and communities of color. Because that seems to be the area in which we see these videos come out in more and more between police and communities of color. And there's definitely been a conversation started, at least, between law enforcement and communities of color on ways to fix some of these problems. So the videos have served a purpose, but the question is in the future, if they keep coming out, how effective will they be at keeping that conversation going?
Well, and they have led to an increase in violence in some instances when the protests get out of control. Or I'm curious what your thoughts are on the best way to keep advocating for this in a peaceful way, and how can police and the Black community work together?
Well, one of the things that we've seen, one of the stories I covered in the last couple of years were the shootings in Charleston, South Carolina, where a alleged white supremacist entered a Black church and fatally shot 9 people. Charleston there were no protests in Charleston. The mayor immediately came out that night and said, "This is not who we are. The police came out that night and said, this is not who we are. The leaders in the black community immediately came out that night and said, this is not who we are. The reaction from the people on top seemed to be what makes a difference between there being peaceful protests and unrest in a city. We've seen in a lot of communities around the country that the frustration that bubbles up in communities around these issues of police brutality can and will equal protests. But we've also seen that those protests do not always equal unrest. And I think from what I've seen reporting these stories, the difference is the attitudes of the city's leaders, the top of the city's police departments, and the attitudes of the leaders in the black community.
So I have heard just from several different people that, and in different articles I've read, that we all kind of have this implicit bias based on how we've grown up and the experiences that we've had in life, and maybe things that we haven't actually experienced. And how can, when we see people of different colors, different backgrounds, what would be the best way to move past that bias and combat that?
The best way to move past your own personal opinion of anyone else is to simply talk to them. And that's one of the things that I've been blessed with as a reporter, is that I've gotten a chance to talk to people of all races, ethnicities, sexual orientations, backgrounds, military backgrounds. I've gotten a chance as a reporter to talk to thousands of people from all different types of background. And one of the things that I have found personally as a journalist is that we're all people. You know, first and foremost, we're all people. If you see someone of a different race, of a different ethnicity, of different sexual orientation, of a different religion, of a different geographical location, instead of using what you think you know about that person, the best way to find out about that person's differences is to simply ask them and to simply talk about it. I think a lot of problems would be solved if people could just get the courage to ask. And that's one of the things we do as journalists. That's our whole job, is to ask questions. And I think a lot of people would be better if, especially here on a college campus, a lot of things could be better if people just screwed up the courage to talk to someone else. Just because someone has a different political opinion than you, just because someone has a different skin color than you, just because someone has a different religion from you, doesn't mean they actually think differently from you. All that is what's on the outside. We could learn a lot from each other by figuring out what's on the inside rather than just what's on the outside. And a conversation, one-on-one, between people is a way to take that first step and make that happen.
And colorblindness might not be the best approach to take to that, but rather to say, how am I seeing people differently, and kind of evaluating that, and then trying to be more exposed to different people, or people that are different from yourself.
Well, I will tell you that I am one of the people who do not actually believe that a person can be completely colorblind. The only way a person can be completely colorblind is that if a person is actually blind.
Well, and isn't that kind of stripping somebody of their identity too, to say that I'm colorblind?
Right.
And so, I mean, there's so much history, and so.
I honestly think people who say they're colorblind are taking a cop-out. They're not really colorblind. Where we should get to in this country is where we can acknowledge a person's differences and not care. Not saying, I don't see the fact that you're a Southerner, or I don't see the fact that you're a military veteran, or I don't see the fact that you're black or white or Asian or Latino. We need to get to the point where we can see all of those things and not care. because everyone has the ability to choose their own identity. I choose to say that I'm a Southerner, that I was born in Mississippi. I'm proud of that. I choose to say that I'm black. But that shouldn't matter to someone else. What they should do is they should judge me on my actions. They should judge me for my skills, not for the fact that I'm a black Southerner. So I think with a lot of situations that it would help if we acknowledge a person's difference, that we acknowledge that this person is a woman, this person is a man, but we don't care, that we can relate to that person still as a person and acknowledge that person's differences, but don't let it stop us from relating to that person.
And so for the person that wants to be exposed to different types of people than themselves, it can be kind of awkward, I feel like. And so, I mean, I've seen this happen before.
Right.
And so how can people kind of relate to others that are different from themselves and be cool about it, I guess would be maybe the right word.
This is one of the reasons why I suggest journalism as a career, because it is a field in which you are going to meet people who are not like you. You're going to interact on a daily basis with everyone. You're going to talk to people who are not like you, who don't think the way you do, who don't worship the way you do, who don't live the way you do. Not only, you're going to meet people who are rich, who are poor, who are somewhere in between, like most of us, somewhere in between. This is one of the reasons why I suggest journalism as a career for people, because it will help you experience things that you never would have expected. I never would have expected to meet someone who was going to offer me a chance to put on a KKK robe. I would have never expected that as a journalist I would get to fly on Air Force One with the president. I would have never expected that I would have gotten to meet, Denzel Washington or Julia Roberts. I would have never, someone who grew up on a farm in Mississippi, I would have never expected those type of things. But journalism brought me into worlds I had never conceived of as a child. And that's one reason why I highly suggest journalism for anyone. But even outside of that,
that's what I was going to ask, because I know that I'm not wired to be an engineer, and so
right.
maybe they're not wired to be journalists. How can they
even outside of that,
connect with people?
I think students and people in general should make an effort, a daily effort, to meet someone they don't know and to talk to someone they don't know. Because you're going to find out things that you wouldn't learn inside your one circle of friends. We tend to associate with people who think like us and who are from the same backgrounds and who are going in the same directions. But you never know what you might learn from someone outside of your circle. This is why it's always great for people to volunteer to do different things, whether it's a food drive, whether it's a clothing drive. This is why it's always great for people, even if you are of a certain religion, to attend churches in different places. You get to learn about the world instead of being insulated in one tiny bubble. I know it's more comfortable to be in your bubble, but I guarantee you, if you pop that bubble and you walk outside of it and see what else is in this great world of ours, you'll become a much more complete human being.
That's excellent advice, and I think that's something we can all learn from. We just want to thank you for being here with us and for all of your wonderful insight and for sharing your experiences with us. What an incredible journey you've been on.
Thank you so much. And I am so happy that I got to spend part of this year at the University of Arkansas, because this was a place, part of the country I'd never been to. So I'm really glad that I've had a chance to meet a lot of the students and professors here at the University of Arkansas, and I will make sure that Arkansas is a place I come back to in the future.
Great. Well, I'm excited to keep in touch with you and stay friends. So thanks again for being with us today.
Thank you.